Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for coming on. This is week 4. We're all on the shore, underneath the walls of Troy, waiting for a boat home. So we begin the Odyssey tonight. I thought that just a couple of comments. One of our class asked me to just reflect a moment for actually how were these stories told? How did Homer actually do this? And we brought this up in the first talk, but it might be fun just to review this again. Homer is a name that is assigned to this great poet. The first of his epics, the Iliad, is 16,000 lines long, and the Odyssey, which we'll start tonight, is 12,000. You cannot memorize these, but you can synthesize them, so they're created new every time with a genius that he had for telling story. But this was his living. There were a group of bards called the Homeridae who went all over the place telling these stories, and I'm assuming they got paid for it. Homer came from Chios, which is an island off the coast of Turkey. And when you listen to the Iliad or the Odyssey, it takes 12, 15, 18 hours. So all of this is done over a period of time. And Homer would come into the amphitheater or the theater. People would be there, men and women. And he would sing these, accompanying himself on a lyre. And the reason he sang them is that ancient Greek was almost a sung language. When you went up or down at the end of a word, that would make a different word. So you almost had to sing these, and he accompanied himself probably on a 4-string lyre. And he did this as poetry. Dactylic hexameter was the poetry that he used. So this extraordinary performance of spontaneously creating a story that everybody knew in dactylic hexameter and singing it for days and enthralling an audience was an accomplishment that I think we can all appreciate how extraordinary it really was. So that's a little bit of the background of how did these actually go. And he went from town to town doing this. Tonight we're going to begin the Odyssey, and we've tried to do each one of these a little bit differently. So we're not going to read any of the text tonight, as we have with the Iliad. And I wanted us to see how Homer wrote Fagles translations, and that's why we looked at the text. But tonight, we get to be even more creative. We tell the stories ourselves. So many of you have volunteered to tell one of these stories, and thank you for that. You can tell it in your own words. And I've decided to do it in such a way that we will go through it, not as Homer told it, because he began in the middle of things and did things in flashbacks. But I wanted to do it from leaving Troy to getting home to Ithaca, because in each one of those stories, sequentially, we learn something very important, not only about the story, but about the psychology that we're going to uncover in our last class. So I'd like to begin in that kind of way. But first, let's go back a little bit. This was a slide I showed at our first presentation. And the reason for showing this is that there's been some remarkable new discoveries. I don't know if you all saw this, from Indonesia and Borneo this week. And we were talking about it as such a remarkable set of discoveries. This is a cave painting from Lascaux. And we showed this at our first talk. And we have no idea what the artist was thinking. But here is a man in a bird mask with a bird staff, with an erection and an eviscerated bull. We have no idea what the artist was thinking when he created this. And yet this is a magical painting. And we made the point that in talking about why Homer was important, for the first time with Homer, because we have a written alphabet and we can write the story and we can spread it that way, for the first time in history, we have, through the artistic vehicle of an epic poem, a clear vision of the human soul and expression of the human psychology. And that's why this artistic concept of these two epics is so important for us. But let's take a look at what else has been recently discovered. This is one of the new cave paintings just discovered in Borneo. And it's even older than the cave paintings in Europe. Who knew? I mean, we assumed that as we evolved and left Africa and came into Europe, that was the location of the cave paintings. But this painting, which is so similar to the ones in Europe, you can see the horns of the bull and the hands over here, may be as old as 52,000 years old. In a limestone cave in Borneo. And remember what we said, that the locals know what's going on? The anthropologists and the archaeologists took pictures of the paintings in, for example, Lascaux, and showed them to the natives in Borneo. And they said, ever seen any of these? And they said, oh yeah, we've got caves over here with stuff like that. And that's how they were discovered. So this magical painting, 52,000 years old, look at these hands. We've seen these all through the cave paintings in Europe. This is in Borneo. This is a long way away. You have to assume that our ancestors that left Africa knew how to do this, so that when they got to Europe or when they got to Borneo, they were doing it. And the other remarkable thing is that there are two ages of hand paintings here, 20,000 years apart. The old ochre red and the magenta colored are 20,000 years apart. So if you think about the culture that these people had, this goes back 52,000 years to 10,000 years ago when they stopped painting the caves. You have a culture of 40,000 years. How old is our modern culture? When would you say that we began? Maybe with Homer?
Renaissance.
Jerry's in the Renaissance. I agree with that. Tuesday. That is a perfect answer for a James Joyce scholar. So I would say that the point is that our culture may only be 3,500 years old if we're lucky. This is 10 times, more than 10 times older. And then these lovely stick figures. Remember the first one I showed you from Lascaux? A little bit similar here. This is in Borneo. So we're looking at the artistic manifestation of the human soul that's so ancient, but we don't really know what the artist was going to tell us or what these pictures mean. But with Homer, we do. So let's start at the end of our last class when we ended the Iliad with these profoundly simple words. Homer says, and so they buried Hector, breaker of horses. And we said there were important considerations from the Iliad that I'd like to review before we go into the Odyssey. First of all, we used the word kleos, which is fame, the pursuit of fame. You don't have to win the battle, but you can become famous through the battle. So even if you die, it's through the combat, through the fighting, through the struggle that you become famous. And that is what is to be highly desired throughout the Iliad. We talked about masculine and feminine and how masculine the Iliad is. We'll see how different the Odyssey is going to be. And woman and ruin is characterized in the Iliad as woman strong and swift. The other point I'd like to make, and I've said it before, but we'll say it a lot more, is that the Iliad, from a psychological standpoint, talks about the first half of life. What are we going to become? And I think the Odyssey, in many ways, talks about the second half of life. Why did we become that? What is the meaning? In the Iliad, too, we saw some remarkable phrases and stories that I'd just like to remind us of. Zeus's description of man: there is nothing more agonized than man, of all that breathe and crawl across the earth. That's pretty grim. But that's pretty much what Odysseus is facing. And we will see that only Odysseus in both of these stories has a point of view that gets him through. And he has a great phrase. He says, bring the trial on. And we'll see where he does that. Many other people don't do that. Nobody else does that, but he does. We saw the shield of Achilles with the beautiful depiction of human life. But then the comment that Fagles has in his introduction, that Homer, through the Achilles shield, is talking to us about human nature, which he characterizes as, we are lovers and victims of the will to violence. That is a profoundly relevant question, both for this time and also for our own. If we are hardwired for this, how do we manage that? And Jung will have some suggestions for us. And then the magnificent encounter between Priam and Achilles, two different generations, and Priam says those remarkable words to Achilles. I kiss the hands of the man who killed my son, as he begs the body of his last dead son. An amazing encounter. And throughout the Iliad, we keep seeing Odysseus come back. He's not the major character. Hector's more important, probably. Achilles is more important. Agamemnon and Menelaus get their play. But Odysseus keeps coming through. And I wanted to bring this to our attention because we know a lot about Odysseus by the time the Odyssey begins. Let's take a look at some of those episodes in which we encountered Odysseus that tell us about his character. He's the one that was picked by the Greeks to return Chryseis to her father after she was stolen. He opposed Agamemnon's despair and the recommendation to leave, eloquently. He was said to be eloquent. In fact, Helen said, he stands there silent, but wait till you listen to him. The words come thundering out of his chest, and you'll forget about how he looks after you've heard him. He's said to be a leader in council in battle, and selected as the emissary to Achilles to try to get him to fight. And in fact, he makes the offer to Achilles that he's been told to make, but he edits the offer because he knows that Achilles will never subordinate himself, Achilles to Agamemnon. So Odysseus leaves it out. It's quite clever. Now, Achilles doesn't accept it anyway, but you get this you see this capability in Odysseus as we go through the story. He and Diomedes volunteer for a mission at night to sneak up, and they do. They capture Dolon. They interrogate him, find out all about the new troops, and they kill Dolon. And then go on and kill 12 Thracians in their sleep from the information they've gotten from Dolon. So you see this stealthy, courageous, thoughtful person emerging. Then Odysseus is surrounded by Trojans and wounded and has to be rescued by Ajax. But he rallies the Greeks a second time when Agamemnon despairs. And then when Achilles finally says, okay, I'm going to fight, Achilles says, let's go fight. Odysseus says, no, we haven't had dinner yet. Eat first. You'll never win a battle if you haven't had your food. How thoughtful. And then at the end, the sophrosity that we talked about, thinking this or that, we see Odysseus saying to himself, now what? It will be bad enough if I lose my nerve and run, but worse if I'm caught. Why am I talking with myself? Only cowards depart in battle. A real warrior stands his ground. So here we know a great deal about Odysseus as we find him left in Troy, and we're going to try to find out what happened to him. Sing to me of the man Muse, the man of twists and turns. Driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and knew their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea. Fighting to save his life and to bring his comrades home safely, but he could not save them from disaster. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god blotted out the day of their return. So, launch out on his tale, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too. Those are the first words of Fagles' beautiful translation for us. It summarizes the whole story. And then he says, start from where you will. He'll start in the middle, in media res. But then he says, sing for our time too. I'd like to make this point now and then again many times. He sings for our time too. He tells us things that are utterly valid for us as modern human beings. And I think it's so interesting to see how Homer is able to do that. And this is a picture that I was able to take in the Museum of Athens. As I told you, the sculpture was hidden away and being repaired, but I persevered. And I finally got them to let me in there with a couple of guards, and I took his picture. And I thought, that's exactly what Odysseus looks like. Battle-scarred. This was pulled off the bottom of the Mediterranean, but he doesn't quit. Bring the trial on. So that's our hero. Because it says so on his stand where he was found. And he's also got a scar on the leg where a boar damaged him? That's a great question, Jerry. I didn't show you the whole statue just because I thought his face would do enough. But he's got enough barnacles on him to obscure who he was. But it's his leg and the scar on his leg. And I show this picture both because I think it's so beautiful. Remember, he's the man of twists and turns. Look at this lovely twist and turn. That's an olive tree on what I think is probably Odysseus' farm. And we talked about that in our first talk. But it also reminds me to remember to discuss olive wood and olive trees, because Homer uses the olive wood 4 times as he tells his story, and each time it's used differently. It's part of the genius of this storyteller, of how to use something as simple as olive tree or olive wood in embellishing the story, and we'll try to remember that. This summarizes what I think are the differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad's the first written. How do we know that? Some of the really archaic Greek that is used is the oldest. It has a masculine orientation. We've talked about kleos. It's a linear story. It starts here and it goes there. It goes back and forth. The battle goes back and forth, but it's all right there at Troy. There's no traveling around. It's right there. And I think it summarizes for us from a psychological standpoint the first half of life. But we're moving into the Odyssey. It's written second. And I think it's written about 30 years after the Iliad, or at least written down about 30 years after, and I think comes from a more mature mind, from an older man. It emphasizes the feminine in some extraordinary ways, and as we go through and each one of us tells the portion of the story that we're going to tell, I'd like us to think about how could this have something to do with the feminine in terms of informing us. Not all the stories do, but many of them do in ways that are surprising. Whereas the goal of the Iliad was fame, the goal of the Odyssey is to get home. Now, it's literally to get home for Odysseus, but for us from a psychological standpoint, we could say it's to become whole. Whereas this is linear, this story is circuitous, back and forth and around and around. There are 3 cycles, if you look at the map, to see where he's gone and how he's done it, that he goes through. So there's nothing linear about this. And I think this talks to a great deal about the development, human development in the second half of life, the why, the meaning of life. Here's some words just to bring us up to date before we get into the story. A catabasis is a descent into the underworld. We had a wonderful lecture there that Sandra had organized by Jim Kloss last year, where he talked about this. And so many of the epics deal with the descent into the underworld. Well, the first, of course, is Homer. He's not really the first because Gilgamesh also does this, and it's 1,000 years older, but we don't have Gilgamesh as the foundation for Western culture like we do Homer, and we've talked about why. When you go down into the underworld, you can call up some ghosts and question them about the future, and that will happen in our story, and that's the Nikeia, the Nostos, the Homecoming. And the first 4 books of the Odyssey are called the Telemachia because they're named for Telemachus, Odysseus' son. So the story begins with not Odysseus, but with Telemachus. And here's the map. So I'll take the story through, and I'll take the first 4 books in Telemachus and Odysseus, and then we'll get into the travels that go on. Just to orient us, here's Troy, and here's Ithaca. And so here is Ithaca right now, where Telemachus is. And he's at home. He's about 20 years old. He doesn't know his father. His father left when he was a baby. Couldn't recollect his father. But he's got a serious problem. There are 108 suitors that want to marry his mother. So she has a big problem too, but so does he. And if one of them does, then he's out of business because he's going to be replaced as the future king. And yet he has no experience. He's never been tried and tested. He's not battle tested. So here we have Telemachus at home worrying about his mother, who's being courted by 108 people. And his father is sitting on the island of Ogygia, which is over here in Calypso's island. We'll find out how he got there. But they're both stuck. And here's where Athena comes in. She inspires both of them to move. And she gets to Telemachus and she said, "You got to go out and look for your dad." And She inspires him, she raises a crew for him, and off he goes to look for his father. This is a brilliant way that Homer offers us one of the two transformations that are going to occur. If there are major transformations in life, and one of them is from adolescence to adulthood, and the other is through midlife, they're both going on simultaneously. Here's Telemachus leaving home to earn his kleos, if you will. He's only 20 years old. He's going to look for his dad. And Odysseus is trying to get home his nostos to become a mature man. And both of these are going on in parallel. Well, Telemachus makes a good effort of it, and he stops first at Pylos, where he meets Nestor, who was one of our heroes from the Iliad. Nestor treats him beautifully. Remember, we talked about the word xenia and how you accept and bring everybody in. You welcome the stranger. And Nestor is impeccable in the way he welcomes Telemachus. And then Telemachus goes from Nestor's house, where he asks, "Where's my dad?" And Nestor says, "I don't know." And he goes to Menelaus' home in Sparta to inquire about his father. And there Menelaus says, I last heard that he was on the island of Ogygia. So there's a clue that Odysseus is still living. Once he's gone there, Athena says, you better get back home because things are deteriorating at home. So that little cycle is now complete. Telemachus goes from Ithaca to Pylos to Sparta, and then he comes back home. But he's told, be careful where you land your ship, because they're looking for you and they may kill you. And so Telemachus sneaks in the back way, and we'll show a picture of that later. And at the same time, Odysseus is going to be moved from his place where he's stuck on Calypso's island. Where we're going to start our story, however, is back at Troy. You realize that we've never said anything about the Trojan horse. Not even mentioned in the Iliad, as famous as that is. It only comes up in book 4 of the Odyssey, where Menelaus, in talking to Telemachus, says, oh, your dad had such a great idea. We built this horse and they were hiding in there. It's the first time we hear about the Trojan horse. But let's start back here with the Trojan horse and assume that the war in Troy is now over. And so the Greeks have to go home. And the first place they go is Ismaros with the Cicones. And I think, Peter, are you going to tell us that story? Hold on. Remember, you don't have to read any of this. You can just tell it in your own words. And we're going to reflect a little bit on each one of these stories as they inform us.
I can't remember my own children's names. I can give that a try. So they land, this is first person singular. Odysseus is telling the story. They land on this island, and it was rich in plunder between the women and the sheep and the food, and his soldiers had a good run at it.
They did.
And he was smart enough to say, okay, enough. He was mature, he was the leader. He said, enough is enough, let's get out of here. But they had, as translation goes, they had too much wine to swill. And they basically told him, no way, we're staying. And they decided they were going to plunder more. And that was certainly their downfall. You had the locals, who were skilled fighters, defending their homeland, and they really beat them in battle, beat them pretty good. Odysseus was lucky to get his men back on the ships. I found it interesting, instead of telling, we lost this many men, he gave a very graphic description of 6 rows from every ship were missing of men.
Right.
They pulled out of the bay.
Yeah.
Just a very graphic way of describing the loss of men. He didn't have to say we lost 500 men. 6 rows from every ship.
Yeah. That's a perfect summary. Thank you. And you emphasized the things that I was looking for as well. That once they plundered the place and they had what they had, Odysseus said, let's get out of here. Time to go. But his men did not. And they stayed and they wound up paying a huge price. One way of, and this is a perfect little vignette, why wouldn't plundering the Cicones work just like plundering the Trojans? We did it before, it should continue to work. But I'd like to look at each one of these stories as a metaphor, if you will, for human development and psychology. And the psychologists would say that this is a regressive restoration of the persona, which means, if what I used to do before works, why don't I keep doing it? But guess what? It's not going to work. You can't stay a young man all the time. Do we know people who never left college, for example? That's maybe our metaphor. But you can't keep going back and doing the same thing. And that's what we're seeing here with this. Things are different now that we have grown through young adulthood, and things are going to have to change. Anyway, they do make their getaway. Thank you, Peter. And the next place they go is that they sail south and they get blown off course off the Cape of Malea. There's a huge storm that blows them off course. I happened to be on the Cape of Malea once, and so I wanted to climb all the way up to the top of the rocks to see where Odysseus missed. And it's interesting because if you don't make the turn right around here with a northwest wind, all those ships could do was reach. They couldn't tack. And so he was blown all the way off course, all the way down here, and winds up at the island of the Lotus Eaters. And that'll be our next story. Wonderful. Peter, can we just pass the mic over here to Drew? And Drew's going to tell us about the Lotus Eaters.
This is one of the shortest incidents. Basically just a day trip. They ran ashore for the purpose of getting fresh water. And 3 of his men were sent off to scout and get water. And they ran into the Lotus Eaters, the locals, who offered them some of the fruit that they lived on, which turns out to be mind-bending and mood-changing. Apparently, the locals all lived a very similar to the opium dens of China, where you just lie around all day and eat this fruit. There seems to be a question as to exactly what it was. Apparently, at that time in our history, there were a number of plants that were known to affect the psyche of those who indulged in them. And it could have been almost anything. Again, Odysseus went looking for them and found them in that condition, and they didn't want to leave. They were having a wonderful time. Life was calm and relaxed, and all they had to do was lie around and sleep. But he, with a little bit of help, was able to march them away back to the ship, load everybody up and leave before the entire crew was addicted.
Thank you. So that's a nice summary here. And you're right, an awful lot of people have been looking for the lotus ever since this story was told. And I agree with your assessment. But here again, here's another place where Odysseus says, bring the trial on, we're going to get out of here. But here's another way to look at this story. We've left Troy. We tried fighting in Ismaros, and we got our butts kicked. And so now we're on the Lotus land. And a psychological way to look at this is, and this is what Gene Houston says, if what we did no longer works, and we do not wish to go forward, let's just forget. How often does that happen with, for example, our warriors that come home from Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq? But it's here that Odysseus, as Drew has told us, says, no, we got to get out of here. This is no place for us. So we're going through this transition from the first half of life, and we've gone through the regressive restoration of the persona and how that doesn't work, to how we don't like what we did and we don't want to go forward, so we'll just get stoned, and we're not going to do that. So we leave the island of the Lotus Eaters, and the next place we're going to go is the island of the Cyclops. This is where they wind up. This is a great story. Who's telling that for us? Oh, Janice is perfect. Yeah, but we really need a biologist to tell us about a Cyclops.
Well, Cyclops are animals.
Yes, they are.
Microscopic animals. So, this is a story told by Odysseus, and he calls himself the great teller of tales. So that might be important. So they were blown off course and they reached the land of the Cyclops. So who are the Cyclops? He doesn't mention the one eye, but he says they are lawless. They have no counsel. Each family lives in isolation from its neighbors. They don't bother raising their own crops. The gods give them everything they need. They don't have ships. So he's setting them up, I think, as people who represent an uncivilized society. So Odysseus and his men land on an island sort of offshore from where the Cyclops live. And it's a dark and foggy night. And the next morning, when young dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more. And he repeats that every time so that you know that the story is exactly 4 days long. So they wake up, and the island is covered with goats. They go hunting, and he tells us again, 12 ships times 9 goats, except Odysseus's boat gets 10 goats, because he's the best. And they feast on the goats, and they drink heady wine that they took from the Ciconis. And so there was a beginning. It reminds me of the Bible. There was a beginning and there was an ending. I don't remember. How does it go, Stephen? There was an ending and a beginning. There was a beginning and an ending of the first day. And that was the second. So when young dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more, so here they are. They've eaten. They're fine. They should be going off. And instead he says, oh, I want to go over to those Cyclops. I want to see what they're like. And they don't want him to do that, but he takes a group of 12 men, and he takes a skin of very special wine, very, very strong wine, that had been given to him by someone whom he saved. And they go into the cave of the Cyclops when he isn't there, and they explore the cave, and it's full of pens of young lambs and kids and cheeses that the Cyclops has made from the milk. And the men want to just take the cheeses and the lambs and the kids and get going. But Odysseus says no, he wants to stick around. So they ate all the Cyclops cheeses. And then when he returned with his flock, he closes the door to his cave with a giant boulder so they can't get out. And he milks and tends his flock, which I thought was interesting because although they're supposed to not be civilized at all, he is a good shepherd. He's taking care of his animals. Then he lights a fire and he sees Odysseus and his men, and they explain that they are the men of Achaia coming from Troy who've been blown off course. And they say, so you should be a good host, and you should give us a guest gift. And the line is, the sort that hosts give strangers. That's the custom. And they say that strangers are sacred, and that he then, by the rules of civilization, should be a good host. And but on the other hand, they also threaten him because if he doesn't treat them right, then Zeus is going to avenge them. And he isn't intimidated because he can see that they're just little pipsqueaks. And so instead, he tries to find out where their ship is. And Odysseus lies and tells him that it was destroyed by Poseidon. So the Cyclops grabs 2 of the men, smashes them, eats them, and falls asleep. And Odysseus thinks that he'll attack him with his sword, but he realizes then that if that happens, then they can't move the boulder, so they can't get out. So when young dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more, then the Cyclops gets up, kills 2 more of the men, leaves with his flock, but replaces the boulder behind him, so they can't get out. And so Odysseus comes up with a plan, and he and his remaining men chop off a piece of the giant's wooden club, which is supposed to be as big as a mast, and it's made of olive wood.
Right. It's made out of olive wood.
And they sharpen it, and then they hide it in all the dung in the bottom of the cave. It smells really good. So then when the Cyclops returns at night, and he tends his flock, and then he bashes 2 more men together and eats them. But this time, Odysseus offers him a bowl of this special wine. And the Cyclops drinks it, and then he drinks a second, and then he drinks a third. So then he asks Odysseus what his name is, and Odysseus answers, nobody. And then he asks this guest gift, and the Cyclops says that his gift is going to be that he'll eat Odysseus last. You're welcome. After he eats the rest of the men. And then the Cyclops, who's a charming host, vomits human flesh and wine until he's blind drunk. Then Odysseus and his crew of 4 heat the spear that they've made until it's red hot in the embers, and they thrust it into the Cyclops' eye. And the eye sizzles, and it spurts boiling blood. And we learn that the Cyclops' name is Polyphemus, and he wakes up in a rage and calls on his neighbors to come and help him. And I thought it was interesting that he thinks of his neighbors, even for a group that's not supposed to be civilized. He has neighbors, and he calls upon them for help. And they say, well, who's bothering you? And he says, nobody. So his friends, and again, I thought it was interesting that they're referred to as that. Then they say, there's nothing we can do if it's nobody, so it must be a plague from Zeus, and you should call upon your father, Poseidon, to help you. So then we know that Poseidon is his father. So Odysseus then plans a scheme to escape. And during the night, he lashes the rams together into groups of 3, and he puts one of his men under the center ram of each group. And then, because Odysseus sets himself apart all the time, there is the one largest ram, and he chooses that for himself, and he just holds on to the underbelly. And so then, when young Dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more, the next morning, the Cyclops moves the boulder so that the flocks can leave the cave, and the men are hidden underneath the rams, and they get out. So the Cyclops can't detect them, and he notices that the largest ram is moving more slowly than the rest, and he asks if it's because the ram has sympathy for his blinded eye. And I thought that was interesting because it also showed that the Cyclops aren't completely without empathy, that he thinks that ram would feel empathy for him. And the Cyclops says he'll have revenge on nobody. So the men are all anxious to get away again, but while they're still in shouting distance on the boats, Odysseus taunts the Cyclops, saying that Zeus has avenged him for eating his guests. And the Cyclops is so angry, he rips the peak of a towering crag. So, this is a big guy. And he throws it at the ship, just missing it, but he causes a wave that's so large that it washes the boat closer to shore, and they panic. So they start paddling like crazy, and once they are a little bit further again, Odysseus continues to taunt the Cyclops, and his men are very unhappy about this. And so then he brags and tells the Cyclops his name, and he says, I am Odysseus, raider of cities, Laertes' son, who makes his home in Ithaca. And the Cyclops then reveals that a prophet had told him years ago that he would be blinded by a man named Odysseus, and he would assume that would have been a great man, but instead, here's this dwarf, this pipsqueak. So he insults Odysseus and calls him a coward, and now he says his guest gift is that he's going to call on his father Poseidon to prevent Odysseus from returning home. And then, this is just the little last bit because I think it's so important. Or if he's fated to see his people once again and reach his well-built house and his own native country, let him come home late and come home a broken man, all shipmates lost, alone in a stranger's ship, and let him find a world of pain at home. So he is telling the whole story.
That's where he's headed now, isn't he?
And then I just want to repeat that this is a story. told by Odysseus, the great teller of tales.
The great teller of tales. That was wonderfully done. Thank you. There are a couple of things that I would like to, to add to this. First of all, he was so clever. He said, my name is no man or nobody. But that's almost a pun on his own name. The word that Odysseus used was outis. And metis means skillful person. So that Homer's using this pun, if you will, to both fool the Cyclops, but also tell us what Odysseus is all about. And he's smart enough to not say who he is, and that's how he gets away, because when they say, who's hurting you? Well, nobody, and Cyclops' family doesn't come to his aid. But Odysseus blows it on the way out. Said, it was me, Odysseus. Here he goes back to the young man Odysseus, the Kleos, pursuit of Kleos Odysseus, and it will cost him dearly if he is to get home. Janice, this is perfect that you did this, because there is a fascinating bit of biology that goes with all of this. And we would say, well, you know, none of this can be real. I mean, this is just an imagination. There is a fodder for sheep called corn lily. And corn lily has a teratogenic chemical in it called cyclopamine. And if the sheep eat enough of this, the cyclopamine inhibits the gene that's responsible for the division of the forebrain into two parts. It's called the sonic hedgehog gene. So cyclopamine in this fodder will inhibit the sonic hedgehog gene, which prevents the forebrain from dividing into two parts, and the lambs that are born are cyclopic. They have a single eye. Now, whether or not this had any part in the beginning of the story, I don't know. But I thought I would share that to you for whatever enchantment it offers. Okay. So he gets away and he's lost some more people. And he gets away from the Cyclops. And the next place he goes is to Aeolus. So he gets blown over here. And that's our next story. Who's telling us about Aeolus? Oh, great. So this is a fairly short story, but thank you for doing it, Ty.
Odysseus and his shipmates are aboard traveling, and they come across an island described as a floating island, and they land, and Odysseus goes off to find Aeolus, who is the king of the island, and he finds him in his palace with his wife and his children, that is to say, 6 sons and 6 daughters who are married, it says. And they enjoy a feast with wine for quite a while. And then Aeolus asks Odysseus to explain what he's been up to in the story, and he tells him the story of his trials and tribulations and the fall of Rome. And when he finishes that, Odysseus asks Aeolus for assistance in his trip going home. And Aeolus says yes, he could help him. And so he says, I will give you a guest gift. And Aeolus is the Greek god of wind. And so what he does is to take all of the winds but one and puts them in a sack, which is made of an ox skin, ox hide, and he ties it tightly, and Odysseus takes it and puts it on the ship among his things. And the one wind which is not put in the bag is the west wind. And they get aboard the ship, and the west wind blows them toward their goal for 9 days. And they can spy the land, and they see fires. But at that point, Odysseus is tired, and he's going to take a break, takes a nap. And while he is sleeping, his crew start talking, and they're very unhappy because Odysseus has been, according to them, every time they stop at another spot, he gets a guest gift. And presumably, these are things of great value, gold and silver, and he's not sharing them with his shipmates. So they find the sack, and they open the sack, and out come all these winds, and there's a tremendous storm, and it blows the ships back to the island. And so Odysseus goes back to find the king and explains what happened, and he said, "Could you help me again? Because we need help to get back to on our way home." And Aeolus says, "I'm sorry, I've helped you once, now you're on your own." And so Odysseus gets back in his ship, and at that point, his shipmates now have to do the rowing, and they start rowing with no help from the wind.
Thank you very much, Ty. So what's happened here is that Odysseus hasn't gone quite far enough to be able to get home. He hasn't gone through the hard work of the trip to Hades and the self-examination that imparts. And I forgot to ask when we were back with the Cyclops, is there anything possibly feminine about the experience in the Cyclops cave? Because we're trying to see if there's any feminine influences on any of these stories as we go through. Well, I'll throw out three things. The Cyclops was a male, but he lives in a cave, which can be a metaphor for female genitalia. He's blinded by a spike of olive wood. And the interesting word that Homer uses, which is extraordinary, when he says, "My eye hurts," the word that he uses is the same word for pain in childbirth. So if there is a movement in the direction towards a feminine influence on Odysseus, maybe it starts in the Cyclops cave. I can't find anything in the story of Aeolus, except that Odysseus hasn't done the hard enough work yet, and he's blown off course and he comes back, and then, as you properly point out, the wind isn't blowing and he's rowing. It's hard work now. And so they do row, and the next stop for them is the Laestrygonians. And I think, do you have that, Hal? Yep. This is a short but interesting story. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, when Aeolus curses Odysseus, and he says he must be despised by the deathless gods because he came back. His men then row for 6 days and 6 nights nonstop. And just sort of as my own personal footnote to this, it seems at this point that this sense of unequivocally welcoming the guest is starting to break down culturally, or at least for the story, because Aeolus, welcomes him and gives him the gift, and the crew doesn't adequately respect it, and doesn't adequately respect Odysseus. So the second time they go back, they get kicked out. And that sets up what happens with the Laestrygonians, because when on the seventh day, they reach the Laestrygonians, and it's a harbor, apparently a very good one, with high walls protecting it. He describes the harbor as never a swell there, big or small, a milk-white calm spreads all over the place. and his the other ships, seeing the welcoming harbor, go in. Odysseus moors his ship outside the harbor. He does not go in. You get the feeling he's a little suspicious of it, but he doesn't really explain it. And then basically he sends some of the crew in to find out who's there and what's going on, because as they pull in, there's nobody there. They basically they see nothing. So he sends three in to figure out what's going on, and they meet the daughter of the king. The king is Antiphades, and they meet his, as they describe it, his strapping daughter. And I suspect Harmar's going to do something with that in a minute. But she sends them off to the fort, to the palace, and inside they find Antiphades' wife, a woman huge as a mountain crag, who filled them all with horror. So there does seem to be a change there as well. But when the king walks in, the first thing he does is to grab one of the men that Odysseus had sent in, rip him apart, and eat him. Tore him up for dinner is the phrase. And the other two escaped, went back to the boats to warn the boats, but at that point they were stuck. They were in the harbor, surrounded by the harbor walls, and the Laestrygonians attacked them all. Hundreds, he says, not like men but like giants, and they flung great rocks and sank the entire fleet that was in the harbor. Odysseus is outside the harbor, so he and the crew on his ship escape it, but everybody else is killed off in the harbor. As Homer puts it, they were speared like fish. So it was, and part of the reason I suggest that this may be a falling apart of the tradition of hospitality is there is no warning that this was going to be happening. They were sort of, by the daughter of the king, they were invited to run up to the palace. They go up to the palace, and immediately the horror begins. So basically, that's the story.
Thank you.
And Odysseus pulls away, and hightails it, happy to escape their death.
And we do know, thank you, Hal, it was perfect. And we know the name of the king, don't we?
Anything.
What's the name of the daughter and the queen? Neither one of them has a name.
You're right.
They're nameless.
Yep.
These are nameless, very dangerous feminine powers that eat people. It's about as basic as it can get. And when they get away from the Laestrygonians, the next step is the island of Circe. And I think, Stephen, that's your cue.
So, Antiphates and his monstrous wife and his terrible Laestrygonians kill and eat all my men and destroy all my ships, save one single Pentecostaros, one single 50-oared ship. And we head out across the dark sea as fast as we can until, at the point of absolute exhaustion, we spy an island, Aeia, the island of the enchantress Circe. We land, we crawl up on the shore, and we weep. And we weep for 3 days. At last I get up and climb a hill and see in the center of the island smoke. I come down on the way, killing a stag. I reach my men, we light fires, we eat, and I tell them there is a habitation. And they weep again with terror. There are 46 of us left. The only other leader is my annoying in-law, Eurycleus, who's a coward and a fool. But by right, he is my second. So we divide the men, 22 to each of us, and draw lots to see which of us will go to the island's center. He wins, they leave. When they approach the center of the island, they see a palace of dressed stone, and within it they hear the singing of a loom and the singing of a goddess. And circling the building are bears and lions and wolves, and they are tame. And they greet the men, and they lick their faces. And the men call to the house, and the singing stops. And the great beauty, Kirke, appears and welcomes them and says, come in, come in. I'll give you a feast, I'll give you drink. And they go in, and she seats them at table, and she gives them lavish beakers of wine into which she has poured potion. And when they drink it, she taps them with her wand, and they turn bristling into swine. They could no longer recognize each other, but their minds are whole within their swinish skulls. My cowardly cousin, of course, did not go in, but hid and ran frantically back to the ship, where he tells us, weeping and shrieking, to board it and run for our lives. It was all I could do to get the story from him. He told me and said, we've got to go. And I said, no, you stay here if you like, but I'm going to get my men. As I approach the hall, the giant slayer, the god Hermes, approaches me, sent by Zeus at Athena's urging, and he tells me of an herb only gods can pick, called moly, that has a black stem and a white flower, and is an antidote to Kirke's potion. And he tells me, when she tries to transform me, I should pull my sword and threaten her and demand of her that she pledge not to do me any more mischief. When I approach her house, I see the pens are full of my men, and the wild beasts are fawning, and she is delighted to see me and invites me in and pours me a beverage, and I drink it. And she taps me with her wand, and I pull my sword and put it to her throat, and she says, you must be Odysseus. I heard you were coming. Let's go to bed. I say, nothing until you pledge not to harm me, not to do me any more ill. She does. We do. Then she offers me a feast, and I say, I shan't feast as long as my men are transformed. Free them all. So she sends her servants out, and they are all restored. and they are all given a great feast. And we send a runner back to the ship to tell Elpenor to return. And he is still sniveling and crying and refusing. And we stay with her for a year. And after a year, my men say, weren't we going somewhere? Oh, yes. So I say to the enchantress, we have to be on our way. She says, of course. It is a perilous journey ahead of you, so before you go on your way, you have to go down to the home of dread Persephone, the queen of the dead, and speak to Tiresias, the Theban seer, because he will tell you what you have to do, what route you have to take, what perils you have to avoid if you're ever to get to see your native land. When you get to the edge of hell, you'll dig a pit as deep as your arm and fill it full of flour and wine and the blood of a lamb, and the dead will crowd around you, and Tiresias will crowd, and only let him drink, and only let him then speak to you of what is to come. I go back to my men and say, all right, we're setting off, but first, we have to go to Hades and brave the realm of the dead. There is much moaning, but eventually they begin the clamor of preparation. And as we're marching down to the ship, the last of us to awaken, Elpenor, the youngest and most foolish man in my company, who has fallen drunkenly asleep on the top of the highest roof of Kirke's house, leaps, still drunk, to his feet, startled, and falls. He breaks his neck, and as we shove off to that far shore, his soul speeds to the land of shadows.
Beautiful. Thank you, Stephen. Couple of things that I think are important in what Stephen has said. Here is Kirke, and she is a goddess. She's not a person. And it requires Hermes, the god of transformation. Remember, we talked about him earlier. He has to come in to negotiate this, to be sure Odysseus gets through this okay, and gives him the moly that neutralizes the potion that she has. And the way I think about this from a psychological standpoint, because Circe is a magical, divine, feminine force that is taking Odysseus and helping to transform him into a complete adult. That's the psychological role that she plays here. And that when Odysseus draws his sword, that's not so much a phallic image or a threatening image as it is a sword of discrimination, and she has the wand of transformation. So with the masculine discrimination and the feminine transformation, we see Odysseus survive this encounter. But he's then told this feminine force cannot take him all the way to maturity. She says, you have to go down and talk to Tiresias. Nobody's happy about it, but they do. And I'm going to tell the story of Tiresias just because I think it's so interesting, and there are a couple of things that I wanted to mention. Stephen described perfectly how the sacrifices are going, so I won't reiterate that. But the sacrifices are made, and up come these ghosts. And here comes first his mother, Anticleia. Remember, we've said that names mean something? Anticleia, against fame. She had not wanted him to go to Troy. She wanted him to stay back. And 3 times he tries to embrace her, and Homer says that 3 times, like a waif, just drifts through his arms, and he cannot embrace her. It's a remarkable scene that is repeated many times in literature. But finally, Tiresias comes up and drinks the blood and is allowed to talk to him. Two things that are really important about Tiresias. This is not Homeric. What I'm going to say to you now about what Tiresias is comes from Hesiod, which is about a contemporary of Homer. And this is not what Homer tells us about Tiresias, but I believe that Homer believed this about Tiresias and used this as part of his story. But Tiresias, the blind seer of Thebes, is the only figure in literature that I know of that spent part of his time as a man and part of his time as a woman. Not a hermaphrodite. Man first, woman, and then back to man. Hera was the one who transformed him, and there's some interesting reasons that we won't go into now because they're not important. But here is Tiresias, the only figure, not only in this story, but in all of literature that I know of, that was both a man and a woman. He knew both sides. And it was Tiresias that was going to tell Odysseus how to get home, or how to get back to Ithaca, or how he becomes psychologically integrated as a complete adult. And that's why this role that Tiresias plays is so important. And then he says, you will get home, but when you get home, and there will be much suffering, there's something you must do to take care of the offense you've made to Poseidon. You take your oar, which is a weapon of war, and you walk inland until it's no longer seen as a weapon of war. It's seen as a winnowing fork. And there you plant your oar, make your supplications to Poseidon. And then, Tiresias says, you will die a gentle death as an old man surrounded by your family. So Odysseus has a prediction of how it's going to turn out, and he has a recipe for what he has to follow in order to do this. I think what Tiresias tells him to do is so remarkable. I wanted to reflect a little bit on it with you. You can see immediately the swords into plowshares, from weapon of war to winnowing fork. How are we moving from a time of war to a time of peace? Maybe agriculture. There are even some suggestions that this is an echo, a very ancient echo, of the original home of the Dorians, which is off the Russian steppes, and where they mastered the agricultural life. And that this is in some way an archaic or reflective moment of that history of the Dorians when they came down to, to populate Greece. But whatever it is, it's what Odysseus has to do in order to get home and to make his supplication to Poseidon. And it's this pivotal moment where he's finished with his work in the underworld and now has to come back up, empowered with the script of what he has to do, and directed by this person who is both man and woman. We're going to run out of time in a little bit, but these stories have been so good. This might be a good place for us to pause. I know many others have volunteered to tell part of their stories, which we can do next week. Is that okay with everybody? And if you can't be here next week, I can fill things in. But I think that I would like to leave us right here at this profoundly important moment where Odysseus, now with the help of Hermes, in getting into the underworld and the insights of Tiresias, man and woman, is learning how he can actually get home. So let's stop there for a moment and just go around the room and see if there are any questions you'd like to address on these stories that have been so well told by all of us before we adjourn. Any questions or thoughts? I've tried to emphasize some of the feminine in these stories, as you can see us moving in that direction. We'll get more there when we come back. Okay. So what we're going to do, remember that next week we don't have a session. Next week is Thanksgiving. I hope you all have a lovely Thanksgiving. And there's no class next week on the 20th. But when we come back the following week, we will finish some of these stories that will bring us back to Ithaca and then see how Odysseus actually recaptures his home. And there are some readings that I would like to have for us, but I think that rather than pass those out, because everybody has an assignment for where we're going to start next week, that I'll hold on to these and do these later. So, thank you very much, and have a nice Thanksgiving.